Okay. All right, we're good to go. We're live on Facebook and on Zoom. So it's 7 o'clock. I'm Jesse, Director of Fish and Wildlife Restoration with the BC Wildlife Federation. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's webinar. I think we're probably on webinar number 12. It's maybe a whole year. We're somewhere close, 10, 11, or 12. Anyways, really excited about the presentation tonight. We've got Siobhan Darlington, who is going to be talking about the Cougar Project. Her project actually ties into the Southern Interior Mule Deer project really well. And we've already had webinars last year from Chloe Wright, who's essentially doing the movement and collar work of our deer, and then also a PhD candidate from University of Idaho, Sam Foster, who's doing all of the camera trapping. So we've got cameras, collars, and now we have Siobhan's work, which is on cougars. So it's turning into quite a project. And of course, the long-term goal is restoration of fish and wildlife. And I think mule deer probably started all of this because that's where we really saw the declines. And we're kind of moving forward with science. So really glad to have Siobhan here. Tonight's webinar will be very similar to the webinars we've had in the past. Siobhan is a scientist. She is not a policymaker. She's not a politician. She doesn't get to do any of that stuff. So her role here is really just to give us the facts and tell us about the science. So she's gonna go for about 40, 45 minutes, something like that, show us some really neat videos and pictures and some data. And then after that, we'll go into question and answer period. All the questions will be sent my way through Facebook Live and on Zoom. And there'll probably be a lot of questions that overlap. So we'll kind of stratify them, put them into similar questions. So we're not asking the same question multiple times. So that's the format. The big thing to keep in mind here is this is about education. Our objective here is to give you evidence and a better understanding of wildlife ecology and fish ecology and how science can help us make better decisions. So when you're out meeting with your MLAs or your MPs, you're talking to your peers, coworkers, friends, and family, you can tell them, hey, here's what I learned and here's what I know about cougars. So with that, that's kind of the series in a nutshell. I'd like to introduce Siobhan here really quickly. Siobhan is from Halifax, Nova Scotia, and she's a Dalhousie grad. She earned her master's in science from the University of Victoria, studying white-tailed deer habitat use in Alberta's oil and gas hub. She then modeled caribou and grizzly bear response to mountain pine beetle infestation with FLR research in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Now she is applying her knowledge of wildlife behavior in disturbed landscapes to her PhD research on cougar ecology in Southern BC's fire-prone landscape with the Wire and Hodges labs at UBC Okanagan. We will touch on wildfire a few times tonight. It's top of mind. We just published an op-ed on the weekend, so keep that in mind. There's a huge potential here to restore wildlife populations if we do right by this habitat after the burn. So with that, thanks, Siobhan. If you can share your screen, over to you.
Awesome. Whoop. All right, can you see that, Jesse?
Got it.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you for the introduction, Jesse, and to BCWF for having me for this webinar tonight. It's a pleasure to be here talking about my favorite species. I only spend every second of every day thinking about them, so I will try to keep my talk to 45 minutes. But what I'd like to talk to you all about today is a bit of history behind cougar distribution in North America and cougar populations, what we know about them in British Columbia, and why we need to study the species. So this is the 20th month of my PhD. I started just before the pandemic. So it's been quite the journey, but what I'd like to show you today are some of our project objectives and the progress that we're making so far, and some preliminary results that we're seeing in trends in our data. Okay, so many of you may or may not be aware that cougars used to live all across North America, from Vancouver Island to where I'm from in Nova Scotia. But over the 1800s into the 1900s, up until around the 60s, there was really intensive carnivore persecution, bounties for cougars and wolves, for example, that really removed cougars from the eastern portion of their range. Apart from the Florida panther, which is just an isolated population, as you can see, that still occurs today, cougars are basically restricted to the western side of the continent. But since management plans have been enacted in different states and provinces, managing cougars as game species and such, and in California, for example, as a species at risk, cougars have been gradually and becoming resilient, but recolonizing portions of their eastern range. So we've been seeing increasing sightings of cougars further east than we have in the last 30 years. And we're documenting more and more breeding populations in areas like the Dakotas. And even on this map, we can't even see a breeding population that occurs now in the Cypress Hills of Western Saskatchewan. So we can see that cougars are starting to kind of move eastward, recolonizing habitat where they used to occur. But some of the things we don't really know about cougar distribution are factors that might move them into areas where they didn't occur historically. So factors like climate change influencing prey distributions and plant growth and landscape change. Those things could be influencing cougar numbers, and we might be seeing cougars farther north than we have before. So important prey for cougars in North America are white-tailed deer and mule deer. So we know that in their eastern parts of their current range, whitetail are very important and mule deer more so on the west side. But there are areas where the two deer species overlap. So increasingly, we're seeing more whitetails invading farther north into northern Alberta, British Columbia, and the Yukon. And we're also seeing more overlap between mule deer and whitetails in British Columbia. So this could be important because if there's more food resources for cougar, what does that mean for cougars? So cougar populations are influenced by top-down processes and bottom-up. And what I mean by that are processes like management or disease or competition between cougars or harvests that directly remove cougars from the population. We also see things like landscape change and differences in plant growth and the distribution of food for deer that influence cougars from the bottom up. So I like this photo because this is actually taken from a cougar kill site in the South Okanagan in a burn from, I think, 2016. And this female cougar lives in all of those mountains you can see in the distance. So we can think about the effect of landscape change from agriculture, from roads, and burned areas too, and how that might affect cougar predation of certain species like mule deer or bighorn sheep. So when we think about cougar predation of mule deer, it's easy to think that it might be a linear relationship. So if there's a lot of food for mule deer, that'll support mule deer populations, which will support cougars. But what I want to show you is how complex that relationship truly is, and just with a simple schematic. So if we look at the diet of cougars, in most areas in North America, it's about 80% large ungulates, 20% smaller mammals or birds, for example. This changes with geography. So cougars on the coast, there was a study examining cougar diet where they were eating more things like seals and raccoons compared to ungulates. But in the interior, they eat a lot of large ungulates like moose, elk, whitetail, and mule deer. And in some areas too, bighorn sheep. But they also eat these smaller guys, snowshoe hare, beaver, raccoons, like I mentioned. But cougars aren't the only predator on the landscape, so they do share competition for these resources with many other animals. So they interact indirectly with many scavenging mesocarnivores, like coyotes, even some bobcat and lynx on the rare occasion. They indirectly affect populations of birds of prey by providing carrion for these birds to feed on, and also animals like black bears that heavily scavenge cougar kills, and even wolves. So there are direct and indirect interactions between cougars and the diversity of all these species on the landscape. But an important point is that for our area and many other places, these systems aren't just completely natural. So people influence this dynamic at every stage. So we influence primary productivity or plant growth by altering the landscape or through climate change, or even wildfire. Several wildfires are caused by people. This can change plant productivity for these ungulates, and we also hunt ungulates and we manage those populations too. And same thing with some of these other predators. So it's important to remember that we influence every level of this food web. So like I mentioned, there's the influence of people. There's also some natural factors to account for too, like competition between cougars and these other predators, or disease transmitted to cougars. Also natural causes of landscape change, things like bark beetle disease, or natural sources of wildfire affecting the landscape. So let's bring it over to British Columbia. So those are some of the things that affect cougars broadly, but looking in BC, we manage them as a game species, and for several different reasons. So we look to have sustainable cougar harvest levels in British Columbia. Where caribou are drastically in decline, cougars may be managed there for conservation. Livestock depredation is an important one, and human wildlife conflict. So those are sources of mortality for cougar. What I want to show you on this map are records of cougar sightings and harvest data in British Columbia, and this dates back several decades, I think into the 70s possibly. But most of this data is in the southern part of the province. So we believe that cougar densities seem to be higher further south, but that's also where most people live and can record these data. As you move farther north, it's estimated the cougar density is lower. However, we don't have very good population estimates for the whole province, especially in areas where there are few people observing cougars. For our region in the Okanagan, I just want to show you some of the data for the last 20 years for hunter harvests, pointing out this peak in the late 1990s. So there were higher levels of harvest for cougar in this time period, which is also, I'll show you a period of decline, I think, for mule deer. And you can see the difference between resident hunters, non-resident, and animals removed from the COS, Conservation Officer Service. So that hunter harvest and compulsory inspection data that we get from cougars, which is mandatory in the province, is really useful for helping us understand abundance through modeling approaches used by the government. So this is a government figure estimating cougar abundance for the Thompson and Okanagan region combined from the 90s until 2015. So the reason why those two regions are combined is because there's not quite enough data to build really strong estimates for just one region over the other. We can only really build models where we get quite enough data. Another thing I want to point out is that, again, there seems to be higher numbers in the late 90s, but then followed by this decline, and the numbers seem to be quite a bit lower. And even in 2015, it looks like there might be a bit of recovery of population abundance in the two areas. However, we can see that the confidence interval here indicates that though the estimate is around 600 animals, it could be anywhere from 400 up to 1,200. So that means there's not enough data to get a really strong, confident estimate of how many animals there are. So the answer is we really don't know how many cougars there are in our region. So that's one of the motivations for studying cougar populations in the southern interior. And they're also very difficult to monitor. So even with cameras like Sam Foster has out, getting cougar detections passively is very difficult. So without a food source or bait, it's difficult to detect cougars. They're difficult to spot from aerial surveys because they hang out in places with lots of dense forest cover. So we need more data for population size and the density of cougars. And one thing we can learn from hunter harvest data is age, structure, and sex ratios during the hunting period. So in most regions in British Columbia, cougar hunting occurs from about November 15th to March 31st. In the Kootenays, it's from September 15th. So we can get data on cougar age structure and sex ratios from that, but it's only in the winter. So we don't have that information for the population the rest of the time. We also can't get information like reproduction and recruitment in the cougar population. So how many new animals are added to the population every year? How many kittens a female gives birth to, and how long do they survive for? So that's information that we can't get from the data that we currently have. Cougars are also important predators for large ungulates like mule deer and white-tailed deer, moose, and elk. So we want to know more about the relationship between cougars and those ungulates and predation of those animals. and how the landscape influences those dynamics. So if we have a lot of fire or cut blocks, for example, does that make it harder or easier for cougars to kill deer? Those are questions we don't know the answers to. And I'll just show you quickly the distribution of mule deer harvested. So a similar timeline to what we see for the cougar abundance estimates. So we can see a peak in mule deer harvested in the early 90s and followed by a decline. So we can see there's some relationship potentially. However, we don't know if cougars were the reason for this decline or if it could have been something like a severe winter that made conditions really tough for mule deer in those years. So these are all factors we have to account for. Just because there's a similar trend doesn't mean that they're completely causing each other. So if you guys watched Chloe Wright's webinar, you might remember some of her figures for looking at survival in mule deer. So I'm just going to show you some of these data from her project. So we can see that she's looking at mule deer survival for the West Okanagan and the Boundary region, which are two of the areas we're studying cougars in. And she found a difference between the West Okanagan and the Boundary. So survival seems to be lower in the Boundary than the West Okanagan. She's also investigating where the collared mule deer are dying and what from. So she's collected data in both study areas and found, interestingly, that cougars just barely outnumber other predators as sources of mule deer mortality in the West Okanagan, but by far outnumber all other causes of mortality in the Boundary. So the survival mule deer is lower in the Boundary, and there are far more cougars predating her mule deer there compared to the West Okanagan. So my project is aiming to look at are some of the relationships between cougars, mule deer, and landscape factors and other animals that might be influencing this trend here. So just to highlight some of our research questions. So the first one is, what are the cougar population demographics in southern British Columbia? So we want to know more about the age sex structure of the population, how many animals there are, recruitment, all of that. How are the populations doing? How does landscape change from fire or forestry or roads, agriculture? How do those things and cougar harvest pressure affect how they use the habitat that they're in, and how does that affect their movement? So we only, again, get data from hunter harvests and compulsory inspection data from animals that die. So what we want to learn is, what habitat are cougars using when they make it through the winter? Are they hanging out in areas further away from people where we can't really access them? Next, so where are cougars successfully killing mule deer specifically? Is there any difference between where cougars are killing mule deer compared to other animals that they eat, like whitetail deer, moose, elk, or other small animals? And what scavenging species might be not only benefiting from cougar carrion in these study areas, but to what extent do they influence cougar kill rates? So, for example, if there are many black bears stealing away cougar food, does that make them kill more? So just to show you our three study areas a bit more clearly, we have our map of the West Okanagan area, and you can see there's quite a bit more wildfire to the south in that area. In the west side here, lots of forestry activity. We have the Boundary Study region, which is further east, and then the Kootenay region, which is far, far east in the province. But one of the motivations for studying cougars in the Kootenays is that it is geographically further away from these other two study areas. There's different habitat there. There are more wolves likely to be in the Kootenays than in the West Okanagan, for example. And there seems to be higher hunter harvest pressure in the Kootenays. There's a big community of houndsmen and women there. So we want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on cougar populations there too. Okay, so how are we going to answer these questions? We have several objectives, like I mentioned, to look at cougar population demographics. So we want to look at survival rates, if we can, with as much data as we can collect for adults and the young. Look at reproductive rates of the females. How big are the home ranges or territory sizes of females and males? How much do they overlap one another? Can we estimate cougar densities in these areas? So for example, the provincial government is leading biopsy sampling, which is to collect tissue samples from cougars in certain study areas. They've already done this before for the Kootenays a number of years ago, and they're doing it this winter in the West Okanagan. So we will be getting estimates for density for at least 2 of our 3 study areas. Hopefully we can get some money together for the Boundary too. We are also adding to these samples by collecting cougar hair, so caught on fences or in cougar tracks, so for snow tracking. And also using camera detection. So from Sam Foster's camera grid or any other cameras folks have out there in our study areas with cougar detections can really help us estimate how many cats there are in the area. We can also look at hunter harvest rates to help us look at that age-sex ratio and the differences between cougar habitat use for animals that die versus animals that are alive, and the age structure. So one of the main questions that I get from most people is, how do you even catch a cougar? So before we can collect any of this data, we really need to be tracking cougars. So what we do is we have a winter capture season with our crew, and we go out and use snowmobiles to sled through the backcountry on roads and trails, and we look for fresh cougar tracks. So if we find a track that's about less than 24 hours old, we bring trained hounds from houndsmen and houndswomen in the local area that we contract out, and the hounds can detect scent in the tracks. So they'll follow the track until they find a cougar, and the cougar will jump in a tree where we can hike in and sedate the cougar. So all of the members on our team were trained in immobilizing animals, we're professional biologists, and we have very strict animal care procedures that we follow as well. So to date, we have GPS collared 27 adults and a couple of younger ones, subadults between 1 year to 18 months of age. We've also ear tagged 10 kittens that were born to GPS collared females since the start of the project. So we've been able to monitor already many females giving birth and how many kittens they've had. When we catch an adult cougar, we fit it with a GPS collar, and we also measure its body weight, its body size. We get the age and sex of the animal. We also collect samples such as hair, blood, and feces, and that can really give us information about the health of the population. So we send this to a provincial wildlife health lab, and they get information from this if the animals might have any diseases, or just to see what the body condition is, for example, these animals. So we do collect valuable data there. And just a breakdown of our animals, we've had 21 females and 6 males collared so far. So by far more females. Altogether, since we started, we've collected nearly 92,000 GPS points. So each collar transmits a GPS location for that animal every 2 hours. So we're collecting an abundance of data on just where cougars live. So this data is extremely valuable, and we're less than 2 years in. Currently, we have 16 cougars whose collars are actively transmitting. We've had one collar fall off a male after about a month. Each collar has a rod off strip, which is just a piece of fabric that degrades over time, and eventually the collar falls off, generally around the 2 to 3 year mark. So the cougars are not wearing the collars for life, typically. We've had 4 adult mortalities that we've documented so far. So one was from hunter harvest, one was from livestock conflict, one was from potential poisoning, and one was from natural sources. So there was a female who was quite old. We estimated her to be between 8 to 10 years old, and her canines are completely worn down. And we found her curled up where she had tried to kill an elk, and the elk, we think, ended up killing her. So she had a hoof print on her side when we found her. We've had 6 collars that were transmitting, we've gotten data from, but the collars stopped activating or sending us data. The collars still transmit a radio signal, so we are still on the ground, able to detect the locations of cougars by driving around their home range or territory. But sometimes, technology isn't perfect, and we end up losing signal sometimes with collars. We've had 3 cougars also disperse out of British Columbia entirely down to Washington. For our young, we've had 3 females that we've collared that had young with them that were at least 6 months of age. So altogether 8 subadults that we were tracking. We've also had 12 kittens we detected born, 10 of which we ear tagged. So we had 2 kittens that died before they turned 1 month, which is the age we put an ear tag in because they have to be large enough to wear an ear tag. And then we've had 1 case of infanticide, which means that one of our toms that we had collared, we went to one of his kills, and it turned out to be a young kitten that he had we think killed. So this sometimes happens in cougar populations where males will kill the young of a female so that he can breed with her and create his own young. So we've only had one case of that so far. On the picture on the right, you can see how we measure age. So the staining on the teeth is an intermediate level. Young cats have very white teeth. Old cats have very yellow teeth that are extremely worn in the canines. And the gums don't look very healthy. And we also measure gum recession. So how much the gum line recedes in the canine can indicate how old the animal is. So what I want to show you here is just how powerful the data is that we collect on a single cougar. So you can see this female on the left-hand side. This is C10, one of our females we collared in the boundary study area. We've had over 7,000 locations transmitted from her since last year. This is a female where we went to one of her kills, which is a white-tailed deer, in March of 2020 and installed a trail camera facing her kill. And we laid the cameras out for 30 days. And when we returned, we found photos of her mating with the tom. And the gestation period for cougars is only 3 months. So 3 months, nearly to the day of this photograph being taken, we detected this pattern in her GPS data. So a large cluster of points in one location for over a week at a time, indicating that this is not just a kill site, it's probably a den. So what we do is we hike into these large clusters. We drop a location in the center of where all the points are coming in, and we hike out to see if we can find either a kill or a cougar den or a bed site. So in this case, we found the cougar denning inside a slash pile, and we could hear the kittens meowing from underneath her. And with a long telephoto lens, because we keep our distance, we were able to get a photo, and with some editing, you can see her inside the slash pile. So 4.5 weeks from that time, we went back to the den and ear tagged her 2 young. So we found a male and a female, and we were able to monitor them from now on using cameras at the mother's kill sites. So we don't return back to the den again. We just leave her to rear her young. And about 2 months after they're born, she starts bringing her young to kills with her. And that's how we can detect whether or not the kittens are still alive. So you can see, basically, they're very playful on the cameras. But what I want to show you is this little female. So she's got a tag in her left ear with red tape on it to distinguish her easily on the camera from her brother. So we were monitoring the mother's kills after this to see if they were both still alive. And unfortunately, we did not detect the male again. So we think that he died at around the 2-month mark. He was no longer on any of the cameras with the mother. However, we are still detecting the young female. So when she is about the size of her mother, we are hoping that we can go and GPS collar her and continue monitoring her. But when they're young, we don't have any GPS devices on them. They're too small to wear a collar. So we use ear tags and cameras to get at that. So our next objective is to look at habitat use of cougars, and we want to know what kind of landscape characteristics they use, not just for movement or hunting grounds, but also where they kill their prey. We want to know specifically the influence of recent burns. So do cougars kill deer or use burns very often, or do they avoid burns in their territory? What is the influence of widespread cup locks, for example? If we combine things like looking at cup locks and terrain, we can also think about visibility and terrain ruggedness. So if a cougar is in a cup lock that isn't very old, it might be able to see quite far if there are any foraging mule deer, for example. So not just whether or not there's a cup lock, but what the terrain is like too is important for whether or not cougars can easily detect prey, and also how much edge habitat there is for ambushing. So we want to look at differences not only in the summertime, but also in the winter on mule deer at winter and summer range. We also want to look at overlapping mule deer and cougar collar data. So this was a really interesting moment for us with Chloe's PhD work. She had a mortality signal from one of her does in the Summerland area, and she emailed me and said, "Is this one of your cougars?" And I said, "I don't know, maybe I'll check my data." And I went out and investigated with one of our colleagues this mule deer mortality, and we set up a camera on the carcass. We found that it looked to be a cougar kill. It was completely buried in woody debris at the base of a tree. And sure enough, our collared female was detected on that camera that we put up. So using both GPS collars from both animals, we were able to look at the moment that these two animals encountered one another. So you can see her deer collared in 2019 migrating to the Summerland area. You can see her territory is not very big. And then in a moment, you'll see our cougar coming in on the scene. So already you can see that the cougar moves significantly more than the mule deer does. She makes a number of kills before she finds this mule deer. And there's the moment where she got her. Another interesting thing we can look at with our cougar collar data is not just interactions between cougars and mule deer, but also cougars and other cougars. So that same female, we also collared last summer in August 2020, 2 of her 3 subadults. So Sam Foster detected that same female on the camera here with the collar with 3 young, and sent us this picture in July. And then we were able to collar 2 of the young because they were big enough to wear a collar. So we didn't get the 3rd one, but we did get a male and female. And in this video, you can see when they spend time with their mother and then they go their separate ways. So we can see the moment the young disperse away from their mother and go off on their own. And the brother and sister are together for that first bit. Now you can see them leaving each other, and the male spent a little bit more time with his mother, but not much more. So this male ended up going north of the connector, and he was the one, unfortunately, whose collar fell off early. But the female we are still monitoring, and she ended up moving further west and lives out near the Princeton area. So our third objective too is to look at cougar diet. So not just landscape use, but also what they're eating and where they eat them. So what do cougars kill? Where do they kill them and when? What time of year or what time of day? We want to look at kill rates of how many animals they kill in a week. The average for cougars is about 1 deer-sized prey per week, but that can depend on the season. So we want to look at seasonal differences, whether or not cougars might be specializing on mule deer. They're generally considered generalist predators because they eat so many different things. However, that signal we're seeing from Chloe's work in the boundary might indicate that there's some preference for mule deer over some of these other animals that are in the area. We also want to look to identify factors that increase mule deer risk to cougar predation. So what is it about kill sites where mule deer are dying from cougars that's different about where other animals die from cougar predation? We might be able to identify habitat characteristics or something like that. So to do this, like I mentioned before, we hike into those clusters of GPS locations at least 12 hours worth of time. Just because there are so many cougar clusters, it's really difficult to get to all of them. So we do our best to go to sites where we think there's a decent chance of finding a kill. So we conduct mortality site investigations. We search these clusters up to 100 or 200 meters out from where we drop our center location until we find something. We collect data on the cougar prey. So we collect hair samples, we get the species, prey age from the teeth. Sometimes all we find is a pile of hair and a jaw, which is useful because we can at least get the prey age. We do collect cougar scat because using this method of cougars staying on a kill for at least 12 hours generally means we're only ever going to get large animals. So it's very difficult to detect cougars eating small animals with this method because a cougar isn't going to spend 12 hours eating a snowshoe hare for the most part. They'll spend several days eating a deer. We can also collect the femur from these ungulates to look at bone marrow or fat content to see what the body condition was like for those animals. And we measure habitat characteristics, slope, whether there's a cut block nearby, what the vegetation is like at the site, canopy cover. And we also install remote cameras to detect not only the cougar returning to the kill, but also other animals coming in. We have also detected cougar scavenging animals that have died from other reasons. And we've also had a number of uncollared cougars showing up to cougar kills, typically in the late winter. So that's been interesting. So for this part, I do want to show you what it's like to visit a cougar kill site in winter. And I apologize in advance for how cheesy my video is. It's about 2 minutes long. And I will also clarify that I say this is an adult moose at the beginning, and I'm pretty sure it's a yearling. So a little bit younger than I thought. But turn your volume up so you can hear. So it looks like we bumped the cougar off of her meal. She's been here for 17 days. So this is our first adult moose of the year, it looks like. So this is pretty cool. Normally we find a lot of deer at cougar kill sites. In the winter, the carcasses last a lot longer than in the summertime. So being here for 17 days means she's pretty much eating everything on this moose. So it's a little gory looking, but we're going to collect some samples and take this jaw that we can see over there and some hair, and then we'll find out how old this moose is and what its body condition is. So if we just walk up past the kill, you can see the cougar's tracks are here. So for size comparison, you can see next to my hand, she's a smaller cat. She's about 1.5 years old. And she's got a little bit of a trail leading away from the kill. So we're going to go see if she has what's called a latrine, which is where they bury their feces and urine. So the last thing that we do is we install a camera facing the carcass so that we can detect the cougar coming back to the kill and also any other scavengers. So we could get coyotes, we could also get ungulates coming in, ravens, or golden eagles. So these cameras will help us detect what shows up at this carcass all throughout the day and nighttime. So there's quite a bit of carcass left. So we only install a camera if there's a good amount of meat left there for the scavengers. So luckily there's plenty there of this moose left over. Okay, so you can get a sense anyway of what it's like to investigate a kill, some of the sign we look for. There's a lot of other fresh sign that we do investigate too. So puncture wounds, for example, on the throat of the prey species or scratch marks. There's a lot of predator sign that we look for when we go to these kills. But what I want to show you here is a bit of a breakdown of the sites we've done so far. So an important point is that not all of those cluster GPS locations result in us finding a kill. So sometimes they are areas where the cougar bedded down for the night and they were unsuccessful hunting and they're just resting and then they move on. Other times they're scavenging kills of other animals or animals that died of other causes. And sometimes they're den sites, like I showed you before. We've had 7 litters. Sometimes female cougars will move dens after they give birth. So they'll have a birth site and then move their young to a different location nearby. Sometimes they do this a few times. So we'll go in after they've vacated a den and collect some data on denning behavior too. But for this figure, what I want to show you is a bit of a breakdown of what we found at kills. So importantly, for the boundary, we've only been able to collar 3 cats in the boundary, 2 of which we've been able to investigate their kills so far. So this data is really only for 2 different animals. In the Kootenays, we've collected diet information for 9 animals and the West Okanagan for 15. So as we collar more animals, especially in the boundary, we will probably see some of these numbers change. But so far, it looks like we've gotten similar results between the boundary and the Kootenays, which is interesting because the boundary and West Okanagan are much closer together. But we've seen very similar numbers for mule deer and whitetail in the boundary, fewer mule deer than whitetail in the Kootenays, and far more mule deer than whitetail or anything else in the West Okanagan. So that's been interesting because we saw from Chloe's work that cougars are killing the main predator for most of her mule deer in the boundary. But we're finding in the West Okanagan that cougars are eating far more mule deer there than anywhere else. So this might be a numbers game, we aren't sure. So we have to keep collaring some cougars and continue our investigations. But you can see we've had more moose in the West Okanagan as well, more elk in the Kootenays, and lower numbers of elk and moose in the boundary. They're generally calves for those two species. We've had a few numbers of smaller prey that we have been able to detect, like quills at a kill site or a raccoon carcass, but those represent very small portions. Again, this is because we aren't really able to detect those animals a lot of the time. So this is just to show you some of the diversity of things that we find. So sometimes we get some surprises. So porcupine quills at one, a snowshoe hare at another. This was that incidence of infanticide. We collected the kitten carcass to do a necropsy back in the lab. We've had 2 cougars kill coyotes. One was near a den. So it might have been a defensive kill because she didn't consume the coyote. We've had a couple of kills where there were 2 carcasses and not one. So in this case, we went to investigate a moose and actually found an even fresher mule deer right beside it. And then we put a camera up and it was our cat coming to both of those carcasses. So they are opportunists. If a mule deer is going to walk by, I suppose it will kill it. Another weird thing that we found was that in the parturition time for deer, cougars will kill does that are about to give birth, but they are rejecting the fetus. So a fawn that hasn't dropped yet will be cached and the cougar won't eat it. So we found that a few times as well. Surprisingly, they don't return to consume the rest of it, but they will eat a newborn dropped fawn. This incidence in the far corner here is an elk that was tangled up in some barbed wire, and one of our cougars came and fed on part of this carcass. So we think that this elk, it was either dead or starving already when the cougar came in. So one of our examples of scavenging from these cougars. And a couple of figures too to show you what we've been finding for age structure in the main prey, main ungulate prey anyway. So just point out here that we do have some unknown ages. So these are mainly from sites where we only found hair and maybe a jaw. So we collect teeth from the site or from the jaw, and we send them off to a lab. So we're still waiting on the results from our first batch we sent in, but we should be getting age estimates for many of these unknowns, which is pretty exciting. The rest of these, we've been able to age the animal based on the simple age class structure here. We'll get more accurate age estimates, of course, from the teeth that we sent in, but this is from field investigations. So we can see for these larger ungulates like moose and elk, they mainly predate the calves or yearlings, fewer adult moose. Most of our cougars that we're tracking are female, and they tend to eat smaller prey rather than big adult bull moose, although we have had one female kill a couple of adults. For deer, we have mainly adults that they're killing, and then lower numbers of yearlings and fawns. Like I mentioned, we also collect the femur to get at bone marrow. So we've been doing this in the lab I'm in now. So it looks a little bit like an episode of Dexter with plastic everywhere, trying to keep blood off of everybody's samples and workstations. But we are extracting bone marrow from these bones and then drying them for 5 consecutive days. We can look at the difference in the wet and dry weight. So by plotting the samples we have processed already, we can see a couple of trends. So this is only for 157 samples. We have more that we continuously are collecting, but we can see that for moose, the percent fat content is quite a bit lower than the other ungulates. So if they are going to kill a large ungulate, it's typically not a very healthy one. Based on this, we can see that the deer carcasses for adults and yearlings, they seem to be fairly healthy. So we don't see that adults aren't doing great. They seem to have a decent amount of fat. There is quite a bit of variation, but we'll get more samples to get some tighter trends here. And one thing too is that the fawns are showing pretty low body condition, but of course they're very young when they're predated and unlikely to have very much fat. So we'll probably have to exclude any young that were just born basically and don't have enough time to build up any fat stores. And lastly, we're measuring the effects of scavenger activity on cougar kill rates and feeding time. So we want to look at species diversity in the West Okanagan and in the Kootenays, where we have the most cameras deployed on carcasses. We want to look at differences between winter and summer. And we want to look at competition between cougars and these other animals for that resource of carrion on the landscape. So many different animals come and feed on these kills. How much of that food is being lost to scavengers from cougars? And does that have any effect on how many more animals cougars have to kill to make up those calories? So just as a quick example of 30 cameras we put out on the project so far, we have over 150 cameras put up on kills, and we have a student, Cynthia, who will be processing this camera data over the school year. So from now until April, she will be helping us classify all these cameras we've been putting out. So far, I have just an example of the first 30 that we did. This is starting from the late winter in 2020 into about June. So just as bears are starting to get out on the landscape. So as we classify more data, we should be seeing, for example, many more black bears showing up at cougar kills. This is just the first couple months of the study. But already we can see quite a bit of diversity. So we see these cougars who we have unclassified because they're not actually scavenging. These are cougars returning to their own kills. And these detections also are not number of individuals, it's number of times a separate event has happened on the camera. So it could be that an uncollared cougar comes in several times throughout a day or several days. It's difficult to know if they're not marked, if it's the same animal. So we're just going by the total number of detections, but we can see lots of cougar activity, of course, the kills, which is what we would expect. Lots of coyotes coming in, ravens, Canada jays, and I've seen a lot of the camera footage. I know there's far more bald eagles and golden eagles to come in more cameras, and turkey vultures, and lots of small mammals as well. So we can see as we are starting to get at some of this data, how diverse the community is that rely on cougar kills and who some of the major players are in taking away potential food for cougars. And I'll just show you two. So we put the cameras out for 30 days to measure diversity. There's another study that occurred in Yellowstone National Park where they just did 7 days with video, but they realized that they were missing activity after that 7th day. So we're choosing to do 30 days so that we can really see the full effect of having a carcass out there, especially in the summer, drawing in all these animals. So this is a skeleton. I think this was an elk. And we put a camera up just to see who would come in to a skeleton with hardly any meat. So you can see there's quite a bit of activity, even when there's nothing really left to eat there. So we are capturing a lot of activity on these cameras. So the next steps for our project are to reach our goal of collaring 40 cats. So like I said, we currently have collared 27 different individuals, and we're really hoping to focus our efforts in the boundary. We're very interested to know why cougar predation pressure on mule deer is higher there than the West Okanagan. So we really need to get more cougars collared there. So if any folks live in that area and you come across a cougar track this winter, let us know so we can get some more cats collared. We would love some tips. We also are looking to integrate more of the Southern Interior Mule Deer Project data. So looking at mule deer migration pathways, do cougars follow some of these trajectories? Do they move to a different part of their territory because they know mule deer are going there? And we can also combine the mule deer mortality data that Chloe has and combine it with our cougar killed mule deer data. So we collect the same samples that Chloe collects on bone marrow, the teeth, age and sex of the prey, and the location data. So we can combine our data with Chloe's so that we can basically create a cougar predation risk map for mule deer, and we can see where mule deer are most likely to die from cougars. So that will be very valuable as a collaboration between the two projects. We also want to look at calculating the timing of scavengers coming to kill sites. So whether or not black bear shows up to a cougar carcass doesn't really matter if the cougar doesn't need those resources anymore and is moved on. So we want to see what the timing is of a cougar leaving its kill and a black bear arriving. If that time period is pretty short, there's likely to be an influence there of cougars just avoiding black bears. However, if a black bear on average shows up 4 or 5 days after a cougar's done eating, there's probably not much effect of black bears on cougars. So we're looking to develop some statistical models for cougar habitat use and analyze Cougar Harvest data as well, so we can understand more about the population demographics and habitat use. So at the end of the day, we're collecting some really valuable baseline data for cougars to improve current models and enable some long-term monitoring, getting more information about cougars in British Columbia, understanding the impacts of different landscape features on cougars. We know some of those features likely affect deer too, so we can add to this body of knowledge to see how landscape features affect predator-prey dynamics. We want to know if any features in particular might be making it easier for cougars to kill mule deer, or if it's a numbers game or something else. We want to know if there's an indirect influence of scavengers like black bears or coyotes on cougar predation. And we're looking to inform the upcoming provincial cougar management plan. So our data is really going to inform this plan that's been in the works for a little while on cougar ecology and their distribution in the province as well. So for those of you who are watching and think this project's really cool, I do, and want to be involved somehow, you can check out our website. You can also scan the QR code, and I'll show it again at the end. We have a blog as well from all of our technicians that have worked on the project, have contributed a bit of a story about their time working for us and the data they're collecting, and some interesting stories. You can also contact me at bccougarproject@gmail.com if you do have any questions, or you need to reach us, or want to send us some photos from your trail cam in our study area if you got any collared cougars or uncollared cougars. And I also want to take a moment to thank everybody on our project. So like I mentioned at the start, we started this project just a few months before the pandemic, and I think we've been able to achieve a lot. But it wouldn't have been possible without all of these wonderful people and many volunteers. So thank you to Adam and Karen, my advisors, TJ Goliath, who is instrumental in this project with the provincial government and getting this project off the ground. Pat Stent over in the Kootenays leading the cougar work there, and all of our amazing houndsmen and houndswomen, and all of our awesome student technicians that have spent many hours hiking to horrendous places to collect cougar predation data for us. So thank you to everyone who's been involved on the project, and all of our funders as well. We couldn't do this without you. Okay, so with that, I'll leave you with my email and website, and we can open up the floor for questions. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Siobhan. We will, I've got a bunch of questions already in the hopper here, and I will try to kind of organize them thematically. We do have a bunch of questions, but just for folks who are asking questions, Siobhan is not a wildlife manager, so she isn't necessarily in the loop in terms of hunting regulations and all those sorts of things. So I just wanted to flag that right away. This one may be up your alley, Siobhan. Does compulsory inspection of harvested cats aid in the management of cougars in BC, and what exactly does it do? That one might be
Yeah, that's a great question. So that plays into the data that I talked about earlier in the talk. So we use compulsory inspection data from harvested cougars or from conservation officers. And what they do is they pull a tooth so we can get the age of the cat. They also determine the sex of the animal, and they get a location from where it died. So this can help us learn the age and sex structure of the population. And we can use that data to learn more about cougars. I mean, we are only trying to get 40 cougars, which really isn't that many. So if we want to understand the age sex ratios for the whole population, that's where that data is super useful. We're also looking into getting hair samples too, and potentially whiskers, to help us learn a bit more about diet, maybe through isotope analysis in the future. So we're trying to get as much data as we can from these inspections, and it's very useful for understanding the population structure.
awesome. Good answer. Are you up to speed? This one is about relocating cougars and habituated wildlife and problem wildlife. The discussion is around Vancouver Island. It's common to shoot and kill rather than relocate. Are you up on the matrix and how that works and the science behind it, Siobhan?
A little bit. So that's one of the things we are looking to investigate a bit more in our project. So most of our collared cougars are, of course, in the backcountry, but we are looking to work with the Conservation Officer Service for any potential candidates to recollar cats that come into urban areas that haven't come into conflict with people or livestock or pets. So typically what happens is if a cougar is habituated to people, it usually when it's relocated returns. That's my understanding. So because it's a public health safety issue, typically the Conservation Officer Service has to dispatch those animals that are a risk to people. But sometimes cougars disperse into areas like urban centers and they haven't committed any offenses. So they're just trying to disperse to a new area. Those are the kind of candidates we're looking to monitor if we can relocate them because they're just trying to find new habitat and they're not habituated to people yet. If those animals could potentially sort of be rehabilitated in the wild and not return into public areas. So that's something we're thinking about pursuing. There's been a bit of research on that in other areas, but it isn't the main focus, I suppose, of our project.
What software are you using for collar movement animations?
So it's a package in R called MoveViz. So it takes all of our GPS location data that we want to include, and then we can make an animation. So it's actually really simple to use in the R program.
Here's one, and maybe a little bit out too. Can cougars also carry or spread diseases such as CWD and AHD without being affected?
That's a good question. So the disease ecology side of things isn't my area of expertise, so I can't really comment on the transmission rates of different diseases. Cats can carry a number of diseases, and that's where our blood sampling can be helpful for monitoring these cats. So if we send our blood samples off to the lab, they might be able to screen for some of these things in the population. Even things like COVID. So we don't really understand how much COVID can be transmitted between cougars. So when we do our capture work and handle kittens, adults and kittens, we wear masks, not just to protect one another on the team, but also the cats, because there isn't any research done yet on coronavirus in cougars. There's been some cases where other wild felids have contracted it and domestic cats. So as a precaution anyway, we are making sure that we don't give cougars COVID.
Yeah, and we also have, if you want to look back, I think in August was our CWD webinar as well. So if folks are keen on CWD, you can check that one out. It's on the BCWF website and on the YouTube channel. Are you tracking any cougars near highly populated areas? And if you are, what are they? Are they utilizing any food sources from the city?
So we have not detected any pets or livestock in our cougar cluster investigations. And like I said, we've investigated 850 sites with 550 kills, none of which were any domestic animals. So that was interesting. But again, most of our cats are pretty far in the backcountry. We've had a couple of cougars on dispersal. So like I mentioned, we've had 3 cougars go into Washington. And we had 1 cougar who was hanging around a resort. And I could just see it from the satellite imagery. It was a big hotel with a bunch of swimming pools, and it made a kill in the forest and behind the resort. Unfortunately, because the border was closed, I couldn't go check it out. I didn't want to freak out the hotel owners, but there was a cougar in the backyard. But we no longer have data transmitted from that cougar. So I can't say whether or not she ended up in a city center. Hopefully, if she's ever harvested or anyone ever sees her, we'll get a report about that cat. But no, we don't have any cats that are hanging around cities in the study.
Here's caribou recovery. Are cougar a primary predator on caribou? How do you project they are likely to be affected by the proposed predator reduction to aid caribou recovery?
For cougar populations to be affected, or caribou?
I would just go with both.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, So there was some work done in the South Selkirks in the early 2000s on caribou populations that are now extirpated, and they found that the main source of predation of caribou at lower elevations of translocated and resident caribou was cougar predation. So this work was done in the early 2000s up to about 2012. So in the southern mountain herds, anyway, cougar predation was an issue. So in some areas where cougars and caribou overlap, there's certainly the possibility that cougars would kill caribou that come down into lower elevations. Whether or not removing cougars to protect caribou would make the difference or not, it's hard to say, because there have been some studies on cougar reduction experiments in the US, most of them unsuccessful in recovering any vulnerable population for bighorn sheep or for mule deer. However, caribou are kind of a different thing. So yeah, I don't really know what the implications would be for either one. It can be very difficult to monitor that. There is a study, though, that is starting up this winter in northern BC in the Tolkotin for collaring cougars that do overlap with caribou. So there is some science being done to see the overlap between the two species. And that project is being led by the provincial government, so not by us. But surely they'll have some interesting findings to see whether or not cougars are killing any caribou over there.
Yeah, and I think that translocation they did into the South Selkirks too, cougar predation was quite high. And then even in Rob's study area around Revelstoke, they had a few collared cougars that were really good at getting caribou, and then a lot that weren't. They were fairly selective. Now you may not be in the loop on this. Any future study planned for Vancouver Island? I know, Billy, they've got some work on the go right now, don't they?
Are you asking me?
Or... Yeah.
Okay. So on Vancouver Island, there is some work on like getting density estimates in the population. They collect hair and that sort of thing. I don't know about collaring cougars on the island right now. They had a project on cougars a number of years ago on the island, but it's been a long time. But as far as I know, they still collect DNA samples over there for cougar and try to get estimates for the population that way. There is a study starting up that has been going on for a couple of years on Roosevelt elk and looking at sources of mortality for elk. And I think cougars are part of that too. So they've also had a camera trap study, which was led by Joanna Van Bommel, who was a master's student at UBC Vancouver. And she looked at black bears and cougars on cameras on Vancouver Island. So she did some work on human wildlife conflict for cougars there, but that was with camera trapping. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So here's the interaction with mule deer. With regard to mule deer migration, how do cougars shift their space use seasonally? Do they use more an area or another of their home range, or do they actually shift their home range entirely to follow prey?
So that's a great question. That's one of the things we want to look at. So we haven't done the analysis on habitat and movement yet, so I'm trying to collect enough data so that I can start doing that in the next year. However, I do monitor the cougar location data very closely so that I can go to their kills on a regular basis and quickly. So from what I've observed anyway, is that most of our cougars maintain a home range where they shift within the home range. So they'll spend some time in one area in the winter of the home range and they'll move to a different section. They tend to cover the whole thing in the spring and then move more to an area where there's cut blocks. So that's anecdotal for now because I haven't done the statistics on it yet, but I have seen cougars moving into areas with more cut blocks in the spring, summer compared to winter. So they seem to shift into those areas more depending on the season.
Thanks, Siobhan. Why do you think you've been able to collar more than 3 times as many female cougars as male cougars? Is it to reflect actual sex distribution of the population or other factors?
So a couple of things. So male cougars tend to have much larger home ranges than females. So one male tends to overlap 3 or 4, sometimes 5 different females that he'll mate with, all in his territory. So typically what we see is this segregation a little bit of different cougars. Females overlap far more than males do. Males will overlap only a little bit, up to I think 20% territory overlap between males, and they share that space in different times. So they're not there at the same time usually. But it makes sense for us to find when we go out searching we'll cut more female trucks because they have a smaller territory and they overlap each other far more than males do. So we might get one male per 3 or 4 females. We also have seen higher mortality rates in males than in females so far on the project. So 3 of the 4 cougars that have died have been male, only 1 was a female. So it could also reflect that female survival is higher than males. We also, for Cougar Harvest, generally more males are taken than females, partly because females in the company of young can't be harvested with spots anyways. And females are in the company of dependent young for most of their lives. So we do see that difference there too.
Great. And a follow-up on that one. Can you please discuss how you would use hunter harvest data to estimate the size of a cougar population?
So again, with that age structure data and also the location data. So like I showed in that map of the distribution of cougars from the beginning, that's from sightings, museum records, and hunter harvest data. So we not only get the age and sex ratio data from that, but we can also get at locations where there are cougars being harvested. And then at the same time, we're doing, we get is information from our collared cougars overlapping one another in those areas. We also get data from these biopsy sampling workshops, basically with the government, going out and sampling as many cougars as they can to get density. So we have many different data sets that help us estimate how many cats there might be in the area.
You mentioned one cougar crossed the connector. You noticed them hanging around the crossings at all?
Yes, so we've had a couple of animals use crossings under the highway. So that male where the collar fell off, it was actually on the other side of a highway crossing. So one of the things we're thinking about doing is working with the Ministry of Transportation, who are interested in wildlife crossings, to share some of our road crossing data with them so that they can look at where cougars cross highways, and they're also looking at where other animals like mule deer might cross the highway or something like that, and see if there might be areas for potential future wildlife crossing structures going over the highway or underneath. We've had another cougar as well, a different cougar use a separate underpass on the same stretch of highway as well, to go back and forth.
What type of parasites have you found? Have there been any that have been infested with ticks, such as moose?
We have not had any parasites on the cougars, no. We have had parasites on the moose carcasses that we found at Cougar Kills some of the time, but we haven't had any parasites on the cats. We do check for it, but we haven't had any yet.
Right, and they're much better groomers than moose are, of course. Can you clarify, did you say golden eagles are seen more than bald eagles at kill sites?
So this was only a little bit of our data that had been classified so far. I would say we get more bald eagles in terms of numbers. So I had footage the other day I went through, and we had 7 bald eagles on the carcass all at the same time. And usually when a golden eagle comes in, the golden eagle scares off everybody else. So it's just a golden eagle on the carcass and no one else is there. When there's bald eagles, they seem to be better at sharing, and there'll be ravens and magpies and things on the carcass at the same time, and other eagles. But we do get both very often on the carcasses, especially in the wintertime. We get a lot of golden eagles in the winter.
Are mule deer easier to take down for cougars than white-tailed deer, and if so, why?
Could be. So I've talked to Chloe a bit about this before because she's worked with both mule deer and whitetails. I've worked mainly with whitetails. I find whitetails to be very skittish. Mule deer are kind of slower, sluggish, and they don't seem to spook as easily as whitetails. I mean, for folks who are hunters, you probably know a bit more about this than me. Seeing their behavior in person and the response to risk. But it's possible that white-tailed deer are just better at getting away from predators than mule deer are. So that's one thing I'm not sure about. That's a good question for Chloe.
Yeah, and Hugh Robinson's work out of the Ponderay, he tackled that. So I think the paper is sympatric deer populations, something like that, white-tailed deer, mule deer, and the Ponderay. So if folks are listening, if you Google that and Hugh Robinson was the author, it'll pop up, and he tackles that actually quite well. Does a really good job. Is there any effect on cougars of human presence between the time of kill and when the cougar revisits the carcass, i.e. is scent affecting site visits from installing cameras?
So that's a good question. One thing I've noticed is that the cougars don't go very far typically when we go and investigate a carcass. So I look at we track them manually on the ground when we go to a kill. So I always know if a cougar is at the kill when I approach, and we're allowed to make sure we spook them off. But then afterwards, I look at the telemetry data from the caller and see when they came back. So I usually just check to make sure I'm not keeping them off their food or scaring them off so that they don't return, and our actions are affecting this relationship. So for most of the cougars, they hang out within a couple 100 meters of when we investigate a kill, and then they come back 2 to 4 hours later. So it's usually very soon after. We've had a couple cougars that wouldn't leave very far. And we stopped going to one female's kills shortly after she made the kill because she wouldn't leave the area and it was a bit more risky for us. Alternatively, also had one cougar who never returned to kills if we went in. So if we went in, didn't matter at what point, if it was the first day she was on the kill, the third or fourth day, if we went, she didn't come back. So we stopped also for that cat going into fresh kills because that biases our data. So if I put a camera up on her kills and we're keeping her away, we're inviting scavengers in. So for any cats whose behavior might be affected, for the scavenging side of things anyway, we make sure we visit the kills after the cougars left.
Cool. Sounds like a lot of fun with data.
Yeah.
Do you have any preliminary data on how cougars are using burns?
So it'll be interesting to collect a couple of years of wildfire data. So our first summer, we didn't have very many wildfires in our cougar ranges, but this summer we had a lot. So we had at least 4, if not 5 cougars who had substantial fires within their territories. One of them, at least 30 to 40% of her entire territory burned this summer. So it's been interesting to watch in real time how they respond to these fires because we have the BC Wildfire Dashboard app on one hand and the cougar telemetry data in the other. So what I've been seeing is that what our cougars appear to be doing is hanging around the edges of fire, and they're even going into the fire boundaries, and they're making kills close to the fire, if not in the fire boundary. So I think what they could be doing is taking down easy prey, deer that might be trying to escape the fire, something like that. And they don't seem to be too worried about the fire itself. I think they can get away probably pretty easily. So they stay close to the edges. And we also had a female who ended up giving birth this summer in August in between 2 enormous fires. So the cat whose most of her territory was in fire, we couldn't go to a lot of her kills because there were restricted area things in place. We couldn't actually drive and hike in because it was dangerous. But I could see her making the kills with the data.
Cool.
Yeah.
Once the 3 regions you're working in has met the goal of collared cougars, do you plan on expanding your search area north, since you were saying there's less people, less information about their population?
Yeah, I wish I could. A PhD is only so many years. But like I mentioned, there is that study starting up this winter in the Chilcotin. So I'm hoping that some of our data might be able to be used with some of their data to look at patterns of cougars in more populated areas in the south of BC and then more remote areas. They also have different prey there. They have caribou and feral horses as well. So we'll probably find different prey composition in Cougar Diet there compared to here. So that'll be interesting to see. But I can't remember how many cougars they plan on collaring. I think it's something like 7 or 8 cats this year. And I'm not sure how long they'll be collaring cougars for, but it's always possible too, like the Mule Deer study, maybe it will continue on once the student is out of the picture.
Postdoc.
Yeah, I'm never leaving.
Now this is around relocation again. Are there any guidelines in terms of cougar relocation? Is there any work that's been done? How far to move them, at what age, that sort of thing?
It's a good question. I did talk to the Conservation Officer Service about that. So how far away they typically move cougars to relocate them. So a home range for a cougar, we think moving a cougar 30 kilometers is far, but they can cover that in like 2 days. So it really depends on the animal, I think, and what attractants they might, you know, be luring them into the cities or something like that if they are in poor condition. So factors like having a cat that's emaciated and relocating it's probably not doing that cat any favors, right? So having a cat that's healthy to start with no prior connection to people is important, I think, as a candidate for relocation. And then as far as distance goes, I mean, I wouldn't drop a cougar just on the edge of the city, but the difference between 30 kilometers and 100 kilometers is really not that much because a cougar can move huge distances in a short amount of time.
Are there any other studies happening at the moment that you're aware of regards to cougars living close to cities within these areas?
I do know of a study in Washington where they're looking at livestock conflict cougars, so collaring cougars that come into areas where people have livestock, and then instead of shooting them, putting a collar on and seeing what happens, seeing if they can keep the cougars away from a populated area or not. I think that's been going on for a couple of years. There's a houndsman leading that work down there. But I know there was some work done. I think Conservation Officer Service had done a little bit of this themselves in Eastern British Columbia, but I can't remember the details of what they might have found by collaring a couple of problem cats. But yeah, surely there's been some stuff done on this in the US. Again, like I said, it's a little bit outside the scope of what I'm doing, but yeah.
Another question: if cougars are killing caribou, why are wolves being targeted? Is essentially the question.
As far as I know, wolves also kill caribou in pretty similar rates to cougars, if not higher rates, especially further north. So cougars have really only been observed killing caribou in the southern portions of Central Mountain Caribou Range, not so much further north. That's more of a wolf issue and lots of moose kind of thing. So but like I say, that we're seeing more cougars moving further north with climate change, and whitetails moving further north too. So it could be a problem in the future for caribou if cougars are moving further north. But for the most part, where cougars have been an issue for caribou, there's no caribou there anymore.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, yeah, there's a gradient. The South curves are really bad. Revelstoke has, caribou that are getting killed by cougars. There's a bit of, wolves and cougars. And then once you go north, it's wolves and bears, essentially. That's absolutely correct. Of the number of collared animals, how many are males and how many are females?
So I had a slide on this earlier, but I have 21 females collared and we had 6 males collared, so 27 total.
Okay, great. And there's one question: what is the dynamic between wolves and cougars?
Yeah, so that's one thing we got a lot of questions about when we first started the project. So I've been talking a lot about black bears because we've been getting so many black bears on our cameras at Cougar Kills. Basically every single one outside of the hibernation period, there's bears at every kill, and coyotes as well. For wolves, though, we've had very few wolves show up on Cougar Kills. The few that we have had have mainly been in the Kootenays. However, we are detecting them far less at kill sites than we expected. So that's been interesting. We thought maybe wolves might be pushing cougars off their kills. What I think might be going on is that wolves are likely eating the bigger prey and cougars are eating the smaller prey. That tends to be what happens when cougars and wolves co-occur in an area, is that cougars, like for example, in Yellowstone National Park, before the wolf reintroduction, would eat lots of elk. And as soon as they brought wolves in, cougars were not competing with wolves anymore. They were moving into eating mainly deer and smaller animals, and wolves were eating the elk. So there's some interesting behavior of cougars avoiding wolves in other systems. Same thing in Banff. So as soon as you have lots of wolves in the mix, cougars will eat different smaller stuff so that they don't interact with wolves very much. So we thought we might be seeing wolf scavenging though, more kills, but we're not really seeing much of that.
Great. Well, I feel like that's close to 30 minutes of Q&A, and want to thank you for all your time and taking the coming and talking to us about this project. Super valuable work. We appreciate everything you do, and Chloe and Sam and the whole gang at the lab here at UBC and U of Idaho. This is, between all these projects, this is kind of in our wheelhouse for the BCWF. These are the kind of projects that we like to support and get behind and have volunteers attend and all that sort of stuff. So hopefully we're moving to a place where we can restore wildlife and kind of, mule deer, I think, were what started all of this, and we're kind of slowly adding on. So great job. Thank you very much. I just want to update everybody. So next webinar is, I believe, October 28th. It's going to be Dr. Carl Walters from UBC talking about the effects of pinnipeds on salmon. So that is going to be a very interesting webinar given the state of the Fraser River. Yeah, thanks again. Thank you all for attending. If you have any follow-up questions, Siobhan did leave her contact information. There were a few other questions related to management that we didn't pose tonight. Just keep in mind, she's the scientist here, not the manager, and we'll stick to that. And as said, the goal here is to educate and to give you information. So now you know, and you can pass this on to your MLAs and your MPs and your friends and family and all of your acquaintances and talk about what you learned about cougars. The other thing to quickly check out, Siobhan talked about all the wildfires we have. We just published an op-ed on Friday on wildfires. There is huge potential to restore wildlife in BC with all of the fires this year. In these ecosystems where Siobhan's working, I mean, fire is a natural part of that ecosystem. It's great for deer, it's great for sheep, it's great for elk, it's great for moose, and as a result, it's also great for cougars. Right? So, please check that out, add that to your list. We do really have a tremendous opportunity to take care of wildlife. And if we don't kind of speak up on this one, we also have the opportunity to go down the road that we've always gone around salvage logging and a bunch of things that really are detrimental to wildlife. So please keep that in mind. Check out the op-ed, raise that discussion as well. 8:20, anything to add, Siobhan?
Just thank you guys so much for having me tonight. It was a pleasure. Thank you, Jesse, for organizing it and for inviting me to come talk. I obviously love talking about cougars. I could talk about them till the cows come home. So thank you for having me, and hopefully I can have an update in the future for you guys as a follow-up further down the line when I've got some more fancy results to show you. So yeah, keep up to date with our project on our website, and thank you everyone for listening.
Absolutely. We'll have you on in 2022. All right. Thanks,
Awesome.
everyone. Have a great
Thank you.
evening. Thanks, Siobhan.
Bye.
Bye-bye.